Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to continue our session with module number 4, a panel with a number of actors from key agencies within public procurement in Colombia. Within our panel, we have Karina Cruz from Transparencia por Colombia. She is the program leader for the entity. We also have Mario Blanco, who is also from Transparencia por Colombia. He is a researcher in the same area. Omar Hernando Alfonso Rincón from Findeter. He is the Director of Procurement at the agency. In our own context, so companies from the UK, we still don't have the model from the Prosperity Fund, but Findeter is one of the entities that implements the Prosperity Fund. Therefore, it is a particularly interesting agency with regards to the resources that are available for UK companies. And we also have Luisa Vanegas, the Subdirector for Contractual Management in Colombia, con Presidente Mariana Rosso, who is the Subdirector of Business for Colombia, con Presidente. As we know, it is one of the main entities in the procurement process in Colombia. I'm sure they will be able to give you many details. Maybe we can leave this slide up for the whole session. I forgot to introduce Transparencia por Colombia. They are a key entity within the identification of transparency measures and anti-corruption in Colombia. It's an NGO, and they're going to provide a lot of information about the measures that entities in the UK and private entities can implement to avoid corruption and take action that will help us improve our situation as a country. So I'd like to thank you all for being here with us. The idea within this panel is to begin with guiding questions, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience. So the first question, to open up the public procurement issue. No problem. I have introduced all our panel speakers, but if you'd like to introduce yourself. My name is Silvia Albina. I am project manager from the National Infrastructure Agency. I've been at the agency for 6.5 years. We mentioned earlier that the way we're going to operate on this panel is that we're going to ask some general questions directed at each of the panelists, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience. So to give you a general context, I'd like to ask you, especially perhaps more so ask Colombia con Presidente, who are a central entity within the system over the last few years and have been for the last few years. How has the Colombian public procurement system become more attractive, especially for foreign companies? I don't know who wants to start. Good afternoon, everybody. We could address this question from 3 fundamental points of view. The first would be a significant change that took place with regards to the focus of the standard itself. The second refers to the production of new rules that have been preferred by Colombia con Presidente, which is the ruling body for procurement in Colombia, and was created in 2011 and has been operating since 2012. The third is in regards to the tools that we have at the moment. So in terms of the first one, it's important to take into account that the standards changed in focus after issuing Law 80. Initially, it was a very strict law and gave the structure the preference rather than the content as such and what state agencies were looking for. So many proposals were just discarded or rejected because they didn't comply with, say, protocols, and they focused more on verifying one step more so than another. And state procurement was seen more as a system and a set of rules and processes that you had to jump through hurdles without actually observing in depth the need that we needed to satisfy through the procurement process. Then after Law 1150/2007, Article 5 in paragraph in one of the paragraphs says has a provision that says that you shouldn't reject offers just because they lack in kind of structure or they don't comply with requirements that are there but haven't necessarily been expressed. So this allows for a correction, and that's what the law considers to be an opportunity for the state for the provider to attach or to send the entity a number of documents that they perhaps couldn't send at the time that the offer was presented, but that in any case refer back to requirements at the time. So as a consequence of that, and I was referring back to the production of new rules by virtue of the new competences of Colombia Compra Eficiente and the ability to correct. In 2014, they issued Bulletin 2013 that establishes an opportunity or the kind of term up to which proponents can submit these missing documents, and they allow them to be sent just before adjudication, giving more relevance to Law 1150, and in the auctions, it included the element for auctions. Law 19, 2012, is known as the anti-bureaucracy law, was also issued with the aim of eliminating these unnecessary formalities so that procurement could flow a lot better. And there was another bulletin sent by Colombia Compra Eficiente that is very relevant for foreign proponents with regards to the way documents are treated in offers. The trade code says that any document that is issued in a language that is not Spanish and that is granted abroad should be sent with the formality of official translation.
And what we establish is that the person can present simple copies to participate, and when it's issued, he has to present, in that case, the formality of those documents. That means the translation that will be the prior element in order to be able to sign the contract. So this increases a bit the participation to the other bidders that at the time of the closure of this moment don't have this translation, that of course means time and procedure that has to be held if they are the winners of this process. Also, talking about tools, it's important to highlight the topic of SecOp 2. SecOp 2 is the hiring system, electronic hiring system that the entities have in this moment. So the system has a version 2.0 that is related to a transactional platform, unlike the initial version that was only for the sake of advertisement. So when they have this electronic platform, there's a possibility that any person can have access to the information of hiring of the government. What kind of processes are open in terms of the acquisition plan, what is interesting for the government, and what are they going to buy in a specific tenure according to the interests of each one of the providers. So also we have the synthesis platform, which is a platform that, in considering Colombia Compra, has said if under the disposition of any person, the person can check this information in terms of all the normativity of our contracting system. They can find the different norms, the statements of the government, the council of the government, and some different issues. One of the main issues that was mentioned was the amendability of different errors or inconsistencies. But also we have seen different contentious points on amendment, even between the buyer and the provider. But what can the companies from the United Kingdom do to avoid this, and so that this doesn't become a problem inside the bidding process? Well, in that case, it is important to have some knowledge in terms of what can be amended. And of course, there have been some pronouncement from the State of Council to state that they cannot overcome what hasn't been properly provided. So it's different to have the quality and only to miss the accreditation. So I'm a lawyer, for example, and at a given moment I couldn't contribute the proper copy of my diploma, but then during this term I can provide this because it was provided in a proper moment and it's stating of a quality that I have before the closure. So, for example, to graduate first and then have it, it's different. But we have to consider this that it could be amendable or not. But of course, this depends of the appraisal that is done. There is not an accurate rule to enumerate specifically what is what. So this 13th deals with the strength of root, but in the case of external proposals that don't have a domicile in Colombia, they don't have to be part of the RUP. So in that case, it wouldn't be relevant for them. But in the case of the guarantee of seriousness of the offer, it was a cause for rejection not to be provided along with the offer. Now with this possibility, it can be added after the closure. Now, what you can do, I have a question. You have said, you have stated that you can provide the translations in the second stage. What happens with the certification that is required, that requires an apostille that can be presented later? Can be presented now and now later when it's granted? Can it be presented, the certification can be presented with the apostille? Well, considering the apostille, this also talks about this, but it has to be presented in the settings of the on the apostille for the members of that council. They can present this, but it has to be ready, even though it would not require any certification or posterior authentication. So, authentication, it's only related to the translations, not to the apostille, because part of the problems that appear when we have the certificates, when they are asking for the certificates of the prior experiences, quite often to obtain them for the tender is done in the minute when the person is receiving the request for proposal, and there is no time to have that complicated procedure of legalizing and finding the apostille and sending. Here the recommendation is those that want to hire in Colombia is to do it with proper time. You know, the experience that you have acquired on the work that you have done as a company or the professional work that you have done. So it's to do it on a timely manner, not to wait for the process, but as long as we are getting experience to stop these, to complete these procedures of apostilling, because here we have the Hague Convention as is a member state of it, so the procedure has to be requested. What can be requested is not to wait until we have new summonings, but also to try, if you want to participate here in Colombia, to try to participate, to have all these apostilles of all these documents that are issued overseas by member states of the Hague Convention. If they are not members of the Hague Convention, now is a procedure of legalization that has been inscribed in Article 480 of the Commerce Code. And with the proper time, again, as I said before, when they have it all, they can have this procedure. When you think about participating in a procedure, you won't have any kind of issues. I guess we can deepen in this area. So what we can do is that we can talk a bit more about, we can retake like the recent changes in the Colombian system. We can talk about the two entities, the Colombian entities or the financial entities that are stating the different changes that they have seen in the last years. And then we can wrap up with an external organization as this one. Last changes that we have had in last minutes depends on the different convenements that of the different treaties that we have had. So the norms are led, of course, by Colombia Compra Eficiente. The different elements are led towards allowing the exchange with those countries with which they have signed those treaties. So that means allow enhancing more participation in the commercial market. That is what we want to do with all these norms that have incorporated the specific situations in the hiring. That is the fairness in the conditions. No, do not worry, because you're not going to be discriminated for being abroad from being foreign. For example, Law 816 that is talking about incentive to the support of the Colombian industry, but that they are easy to be catered by the external offers because they have to incorporate the work or staff with the capability that you offer to obtain these scores and not to be in a to disadvantage against the normativity or the Colombian lecturers or the Colombian tenderers. So this has some specific parameters and support of the national industry where you are proposing different formulas for this support, either having people or offering goods or services that are going to take you, of course, to the same kind of conditions that the national companies. So these would be like parameters that have been set. Therefore, the Constitution and Law 80, 1150 is always striving for so that people, the foreign people, can participate in fairness of conditions in the Colombian market, be it in the tendering, in the public tendering, or in the hiring of any kind of elements that are not ruled by the general bylaw of hiring, but they have to follow some parameters from 2009 of the Colombian Constitution that are always striving for transparency and equality between different proponents. Oh, great. Now, Sylvia, what is your perspective from Annie? Well, we are bound by the contracting law. It starts with law 850, and what we wanted for the public and private elements is to have a special regime that is due to the necessities that we have. That's why we have the law 1508, where we try to specify everything that has to deal with the APPP. In this moment in Colombia, we are massively using the topic of concession contracts for fourth generation for roads, and we have an example in the ports. But the idea is that we want this law to be taken to different or to other sectors. The thing is that we have been pioneers and we have taken all the budget, all the allotment for this purpose. But what we have tried to do and is the participation of the foreign people is taken as it is considered inside the hiring, and that there is no discrimination, no difference between being national and being from abroad. And what we have tried to find with a proper standard work to make it easier in the contractual work is that we want the foreigners or the national ones, we want to accredit them for the financial experience. It was very difficult to attest for the foreign ones which was the technical experience, and to be able to compare or to make it close to what Colombia was doing. So in the what we did was tell me about your financial capability that has some specific benchmarks, and the topic of the capability of being able to lever through some banks or through some capital issues, so that we can compare them in both terms at the national and international ones. That's what we do in the standard contract. And now to wrap up, what is your opinion? Good afternoon. I would like to tell you a bit what is Transparency for Colombia. We are an organization of the civil society that is leading systematic efforts against corruption. We are the chapter for Colombia of Transparency. Maybe some of you have already heard about International Transparency. It is the world organization that leads against corruption. It was created in 1993 and we were founded in 1998. We have been working here for 18 years, 19 years, doing a very tough and complex work, and it is to talk about these topics. So this topic, being able to talk about corruption risks in the public sector or the private sector, to talk with entrepreneurs, it was a huge barrier. And I think that this society is much more mature and talking, stating that we have certain risks on corruption in the contractual exercise and the exercise of the companies. I think that it has overcome that barrier. Now, from Transparency for Colombia, we have the index of transparency for public entities. The ones that want to check can see in our website transparency index.co, and the first evaluation that was done by the Transparency Index was in 2002 with entities from the national body. Then we have department entities, and in 2004 municipalities. And the ones who want to know which were the risks of corruption that they have faced, that different public entities have faced in the national and local level, they can go to our website and find that information. From the evaluation that we have on Transparency Index in the last 15 years, the hiring that is associated with the work has been always in a high risk or a middle risk. That under appraisal, that means that they don't met the minimum requirements that can be taken by a public entity for the exercise of the public hiring. In this same appraisal in the Transparency Index, we see the management of the hiring and the advertisement, or I mean, how transparent is that work done. That was taken from the public hiring system like SECOP. From the year that we had the first evaluation, or when the Transparency Index included in the evaluation the availability of information, that is more than 20 years ago, as until now, we can see a lot of progress, a lot of positive progress in terms of advertisement for the information. Many years ago, the minimum that we had to publish were very complex, but in this moment any person can go to SECOP and they can check any contract that they want from the national or local level. Any public contract is completely available for the person, for the people. And on top of this, something positive is the data reuse. That means that any person that wants to make an analysis of the public hiring in Colombia can go to the website of SECOP of Open Data, to the website of Open Data, download information, and to do the proper analysis, because what we are looking to do in Colombia is all this exercise of reusing the information or access to public information. That is, the information is not jealous, it's not for some people, it's for everybody. And we have a law for access to public information, a law that is from 2015, and it is a law that allows everybody, public and private and citizens, to have the information available. So I guess, my partner, you have some data that you want to share with them, don't you? I guess I do. Well, as I said before, my partner, we are evaluating hiring, and we are doing this in different ways. So I want to share some small data with you, because the information we have is a lot. It will be interesting for you. It would be nice if you start querying this information, or also consulting us those data. But basically speaking, we locate the companies in a scale from 0 to 100. 0, the highest risk of corruption, and 100, the least. So in this case, we can see that the institutional conditions of hiring in the last 3 years were improving for all the entities. We have important challenges, nevertheless, and we have the challenges in terms of direct hiring percentages. As you know, direct hiring is, even though it's allowed by law, it was considered like an exceptional mechanism when it was conceived. However, nowadays it's quite reiterative, the direct hiring. Even on territorial entities, it is above 50% of the total hiring. This is a really big topic, and it's also an invitation for you that are part of the private sector to do a control. As Karina mentioned before, we have an access to information law. If you request all the information, no entity can deny, can refuse to it. There is a right for any company and organization, because you can find any kind of anomaly, not only from the general information of the entity, but also to deepen inside the contractual processes, to state who are going to be part of the summoning, which are the enabling requisites, and also if you find any kind of issues, the idea is that you can also do a denounce. Nowadays, we have different denounce channel, whistleblowing channels from the Secretariat of Transparency of the Commission of Fight Against Corruption, which are going to be released. And from Transparency for Colombia, we have a citizen channel for denounce of corruption, and we're going to have a group of people, specialized people in the topic, that are going to be supporting the people that are denouncing this, so that they have a proper denounce, and from Transparency for Colombia, a follow-up. So these are some rather small data. Thank you very much. I think we have a question from the audience. Yes, the other day I was in a meeting in England with some Brazilian folks that were doing a small talk about the situation in Brazil. So I was heavily surprised, but I would like to confirm this, that the situation, the ranking that it currently has Colombia is much worse than Brazil. We are talking about the perception of corruption. Let me give you the data. Colombia has boasted a very dishonorable position, in position 96 among 100 and something, and the qualification is a qualification that is also moving from 0 to 100. The qualification of Colombia the last years have been 37 points. So we are still considering, we are still consulting the information. So if you give me a couple of minutes at the end of the round, I can give you. But are you confirming that it's worse than Brazil in this moment? Well, we are querying this. The thing is that, unfortunately, from the map, from the corruption perception index, it is moving in different colors. Each country has different colors, where the more yellow, the dark yellow is least corruption, and dark blue is much more corruption. In Latin America, the worst is Venezuela. So I think that it is clear, and we don't have any kind of discussion on the matter. Where we perceive least corruption is in Chile and Costa Rica and Uruguay, from the Latin area. On the meantime, I would have a contribution, something that is important to know what is measured by each one of these indexes. The IPC is considered from the public opinion mostly, from the perception. There are some other types of indexes. There is a transparency index. So none of the two indexes, considering in theoretical terms, is going to say that is the level of corruption, because that is a problem with corruption. If it's good, corruption is not something that should be seen, but they want to get as close as possible to measure this in a proper manner, both considering the perception of the citizenry, the transparency indexes as well, because Transparency for Colombia has another index, and this is taken from the measures of each one of the entities, and maybe they can tell us a bit more about it. The perception index is given by International Transparency. The name is the Secretariat that is in Berlin. They are the ones that make the survey in all the world. Transparency Colombia, in a local level, we developed this tool that is a transparency index of the public entities. This index, unlike the one from TI, is evaluated with hard data, information that is given by the entity. This information is never asked to a citizen how they consider the corruption in the region, in the community. It never happens. This information given with hard data and taken from regulation entities from the Colombian government. So the minimum thing that I have to deliver is this one. So how am I being measured? It's very interesting, but I think that with this we have a really good introduction to the last changes that we have had in last years and the current situation in Colombia in terms of the public procurement. But now I would like us to move a bit towards our audience that are British companies or even foreign companies So I would like you to tell me a bit which are those mistakes, which are those pitfalls or obstacles that you find that first become a problem for the provider on public tendering, but also those obstacles that they are mentioning, they can also become an obstacle for the buyer. So, what kind of measures can we take to avoid these mistakes and to overcome these pitfalls? First is the difficulty of the documents, as it was already mentioned. The documents that are issued overseas, when a foreigner, that we have some regulations that have to be followed, and the recommendation, of course, is to have them apostilled or legalized if you want to participate in the Colombian market. That will be the general rule. Other issues that have to be considered is to know the areas where they are going to develop different projects where they want to participate. Colombia is a very diverse country in terms of race, of customs, and it is very important for you to know the market where you are going to develop each one of the projects where you want to participate. Take into account the social environment, the communities, try to see the regulation, internal regulation of each municipality in the different areas to see if we have indigenous communities because they have some prior consultations, etc., that have to be checked with the communities, that they have a special protection by the national constitution of the country. So those would be the most relevant issues, the knowledge that you should have of the places where you are going to develop the projects in which you want to participate, because that is the starting point. That is when you can identify all those risks of the social behavior, of cultural behavior, and you can establish a certain mitigation scale of these elements that you can find in these areas. Second, the knowledge of the normative. So Colombia fortunately has an impositive regime of taxes that is very strong. This situation is very interesting, and it will be nice for you to know what kind of goods are being taxed by, and on local level, department and global level, because in that scale we can be generating different taxes that can affect the rendering that you are giving in Colombia. So those would be the issues that, even though if you have some issues in the consultation, you should ask directly to the entity that is developing the project or the contractual process, so that they clearly can tell you what taxes, both national, departmental and municipal, can effectively affect the rendering of that you want to make in Colombia. What he's stating is true, and Colombia Compra has it clear. Our market studies are the prior documents from the processes consider the risk matrix, and the risks that we have in Colombia are different from other countries. So it's talking about the social and cultural conditions, which is something very important. It's not the same the civil work in Bogota than another one in a place in a hot weather country. So you have to consider the weather conditions, the cultural conditions, and others. Another thing is that even though what we said in positive terms is true, every single contract has VAT, but they don't consider the estampillas of each municipality. We have a lot of estampillas, a lot of stamps, and we were talking around 200. And every single day the municipal councils are issuing others, and they have to be included inside the invoice that they have in the court. It's not only the duty of the foreign but also national to know which are the additional costs that are incurred for estampillas or for impositive material, and that creates some annoyance, but it's lack of knowledge. In that case, you have to know where the work is executed and what is the additional payment that has to be conceded. We haven't seen difficulties for the foreign entities that were to say that it is making impossible the entrance to the market. So the idea of the documents as such and the observations that are given is effectively for you to guarantee your entrance to the market in a clear and transparent environment. Also, you have all the possibility to ask about any issue that you have, because Colombia is diverse not only in legislation but on all other items. Thank you very much. Maybe Sylvia, In topics of fourth generation, the first questions on the contract, on the standard contract, are about 3,000 observations, and is the risk matrix. Who is in a better possibility to endure them, and not necessarily what happens outside, and the way in which we are registering this outside works in Colombia. So we have to consider around 3-4 months explaining to the investors, both national and foreign, why the conception of first, second, third generation versus fourth generation, where we as a state we wanted to do something that was outside of the scope of Colombian, and we needed to know this, how much the state can endure, how much the private has to endure, and under which range the private has to endure this work, and that was a very difficult exercise as well. Now, considering this story, after these 3,000 observations and each one of them which is uniquenesses, we have 31 projects where the risk conception has been materialized in the signature of a contract. But that was the first obstacle of understanding. We changed some of them because the first standard contract before signing the first contract has certain modifications in terms of which was the percentage of land that should be bought. So I think that several things have to be overcame. One is internal regulation. For example, in environmental terms, we not only have an authority of licenses for primary roads, but we also have certain corporations that are autonomous entities that, autonomously speaking, as their name implies, they can define which are the different compensations for the substitution of trees versus roads. So, talking about this regulation, it is also very difficult to know what is everything that we have to meet if we are outside and we haven't done a proper judicious evaluation. And many of them said that they didn't have enough time, for example, in the first wave to evaluate all these issues. So, problems that we had and we overcame, that was the pre-qualification. In the first wave for the fourth generation, we wanted to take into account the amount of participants, and we did it through a pre-qualification. As soon as those times expired, when we came to the tender, from out of 10 that we have pre-qualified for a project, only 2 or 3 participated. So we tried to close the world so that those 10 can bet on the project, and we found that they were having 3-1. So we see that pre-qualification was not the best when you have many different projects, when you have a lot of a reference, but I'm wrapping this from the beginning and I'm closing the possibility of participating because they are thinking about their pre-qualification. What we did in the end is that we removed pre-qualification. So if you see many projects of the second wave, there was no pre-qualification, and in the third one it was totally removed. And in the standard documents, we removed this. Even despite the regulation, we have to think about the pre-qualification. So that's part of the lessons learned. The regulations, it is the autochthon, the mindset. As we are really diverse as Colombia, we are also diverse in each one of the regions, and it is not easy as foreigners that we come to understand how this happens.
And if you were to ask me today, within the execution of this, one of the great bottlenecks has been the social issue. So how I can face you and explain that I have economic benefits, I have to pay for these economic benefits, and how people don't perceive that because they think that the project affects them and it doesn't influence them. So the way you refer to somebody, how do you explain that this isn't going to affect them, this is actually a benefit for them? In these simple areas we have experienced and mistakes because we've had to learn about how to get closer to these communities, and foreigners have also had to put on their jacket and shoes to understand the way that these regions work. Okay, thank you very much. And now in TPC I know that perhaps you're not directly involved in public procurement, but perhaps are there any mistakes you have seen that come up when you have international entities or international companies involved in government action that you could maybe share with us? Thank you. More so than a mistake, perhaps the risks that you face when you procure entities at a national, or when you have procurements with entities at a national level compared to when it's not, or when it's subnational. The transparency indexes in Colombia show that whether it's national or territorial, there are common risks. For example, managing procurement, the weaknesses you face when it comes to managing procurement are very similar. Contract or procurement manuals are different. They have deficient guidelines. Procurement planning also has weaknesses, whether that's the ministry, a local entity, or a national entity. Accountability exercises, delivery of information from the entities to their vendors and contractors is quite weak, as well as the delivery of public information. But at the territorial level, there are even more deficiencies in terms of procurement. For example, the controls exercised on contractual exercises are a lot more weak compared to those at the national level from a national entity. This is a centralized country. Dual entities and the leaders of the sector are located in Bogota. There's not only access to internet 100%, but the entities have very good capabilities, and at the territorial level, these are absent in some cases. And when exercising surveillance controls are weaker, when it comes to procurement carried out by entities at the local level in order to provide goods and services that are social, it's still very deficient. There are huge sums of money that local entities have to contract in order to provide food at school for children, education services, health services, and that's quite deficient there. In terms of ethics and compliance, they are also rather deficient at the territorial level. Okay, a question emerged throughout our discussion, and the potential mistakes that can be made in transparency. For vendors, it's very important to work within the planning stage with entities in terms of recommending projects that they can cover or helping them cover needs based on the solutions that we can offer. But that discussion and that point of contact with the buyer before the process starts, many people see that as a not very transparent process, or perhaps a bit corrupt. So somebody was asking, how you draw the line, what's your experience? It's a fine line, to be honest. Sometimes at the territorial level and even at the national level, you have to determine the procurement need. If I'm not sure, or the purchasing need, if I don't know what I need, then anybody could come up to me and say, well, this is what you need, and they generate a need that I don't necessarily have. That fine line between, the public entity with all its capabilities in the territory generating and planning correctly and saying what I need, and then calling the business person saying this is what I need, do it. It's very different to having this company come up to you. So that fine line has to be, there have to be some procedures in place, some guidelines and very clear steps. When you are clear about things, when you're transparent and you tell people everything that you're doing, this opaqueness is blurred, but I have to have clear processes and procedures in place to be able to get to this point. In this area, I believe it's important to lose that fear of contacting the market. When I perform market studies, I have to sit down, interact, and hopefully have meetings with these people. If you want, you can record them, or if you like, you can fill the market with transparency. You shouldn't be scared of consulting the market. Findata has business tables, or whatever you'd like to call it, or business rounds before actually implementing the terms of reference, in order to get to know the market, in order to understand the difficulties that they have experienced in Colombia, the regulations that are in place, and we're going to face also the elaboration of terms of reference. So in the market, therefore, we have been procuring many works in water, maybe many waterworks, sewage systems, buildings, whether that's for housing or for hospitals or education centres. We procure mega schools from the ministry that they build at the Ministry of Education. We also contract early development centres and the whole program at the Ministry of Housing. So understanding and learning about the market is very important to us before issuing the terms of reference so that we can interact with these actors. So for example, we can invite 20 or 30 companies to a round table so that they can tell us their difficulties based on the experiences at Findete. So you can see our terms of reference like that we use in both buildings, construction, sewage systems, etc. We try to use the same type of terms of reference, and in consulting we also spoke about these types of references. And through these previously consulted documents with the stakeholders, we sit down and we start to discuss the rules for this new process in which we want to interact, or where we want greater stakes. Okay, well, in line with my colleagues' comments, and perhaps moving on to the next question in terms of the differences between procurement at the national and regional level. Due to the lack of market studies and the fear that exists around, not sitting down with someone, because then they'll be capturing the information and they'll capture the information and exercise a certain level of interest with the public entity. At the territorial level, the absence of proponents is complete. 70% of the public bidding processes, there are between 1 and 2 proponents. What does this mean? It means that, first of all, market studies are deficient, or certain elements are absent, and the entity at the territorial level, what they're asking for isn't really synchronized or harmonized with the market. Low advertising is another issue. Business people don't understand that which is required in entities at the local level. Therefore, there's an absence of proponents. So it's completely different to the national level. On the other hand, 80% of bidding processes have more than 3 proponents. So that's free competition. Things are transparent. First of all, I've understood the market, I've studied the market, and I know what I need to procure. And additionally, when I put forward such an ample offer, it's the same issue or the same case as the public processes, because they have more than 3 proponents. Things should be said directly. The municipal level is permeated with high levels of corruption, and these figures are not reflected because of the lack of knowledge with regards to the market. They are reflected because they have tender documents that have been personalized according to the proponent that they want to choose. So that's what truly happens. I was director of the Envias, where we had proponents in each process. We had more than 100 proponents in each process. Currently at Findete, an average of 25 people are participating per process, because they're very specialized areas. So the aqueduct or water services will not have the same participation as roads. In roads, there's a wide participation. The market is a lot bigger. When it comes to sewage systems, that's a lot more reduced. So participation of 25 proponents per process is significant, but at the municipal level, being totally frank, this is what's going on. That's why the national government, in the current draft bill, they're talking about types of tender documents for all levels, national, departmental and regional levels. We would all have the same kind of tender documents to avoid the situation. The transparency index at the municipal level is terrible because they create personalized or say one size fits, or rather tailor-made tender processes. It's hard to determine a requirement. Sorry, he wasn't using the microphone. I was director of Envías for roads, and in plan contracts that were taking place in Boyacá, Santander, we sat down to discuss them and look at the documents of reference and the plan that was led by the administration. We would completely destroy them with the prosecutor. You know, they're laden with requisites that are directed at a particular proponent because, you know, there are maybe 20 requirements. It's as if they'd taken X's person experience and put it down on the condition documents, and through that exercise, through that activity, we got them to suspend certain cases and revoke certain acts or documents, starting documents, so that we could have Transparencia por Colombia get involved, as well as Envías. In ANI, in Colombia Compra Eficiente, the National Infrastructure Agency, it's different to procurement at the national level, or is it different to these other areas? I'd like to close the first or the past chapter, and that is, how much does it cost a company to come forward to revise the process? Sometimes in national companies, we ourselves do not divide cost centres, so we send a guy to go and do an assessment, whilst foreign companies are quite organised and look at prices to go there, look at man hours and how much it costs to be able to do that. So that also makes a difference, because I'm going to worry about certain documents where I won't be able to comply with the requirements. It's quite hard to change that, and it's not as easy for Colombian and foreign companies. But with regards to the following questions, whether we've seen if there's a difference between the territorial and national level, I think that we've said clearly that institutional capacity is different. We have a specialised agency where there are certain subdivisions, and each one is in charge of planning processes and structuring processes and procurement processes and legal processes. When you go into the territory, you're an infrastructure secretary and you have an assistant, another secretary, and you create the documents with the legal department, and perhaps the mayor's offices share these at the education secretariat with the mayor's office. So they don't have a complete team to perform a continuous process, but rather there are subdivisions, so they send it to one area and then they send it to another area, and it just stays there. So with this know-how, what we have done is sign inter-administrative agreements to try to fulfill this deficiency, this institutional deficiency. Through the agreement, we participate with the specialised area, and we say, look, this is how you should do planning. You should have a master plan. Within the pre-feasibility study, we will show you the decrees, and your competences through this agreement should teach you or help you to make decisions. We've done this with Cundinamarca, with Santander, and also with Magdalena. And what we've tried to do is kind of fulfill or fill these deficiencies, not just human resources deficiencies or financial deficiencies, because obviously hiring somebody will have an impact on budgets, and we know that their income is destined to priority areas, and that may not be the most important thing. So that's a differentiation we've made. We've accompanied them and we've started to fulfill those needs. The most important thing is that they have believed in the way we do things and they have adhered to that. Okay, thank you very much. In Colombia Compra Eficiente, I don't know if perhaps you have any experiences at the municipal or departmental levels. At Colombia Compra Eficiente, we've seen a number of situations. First is ignorance with regards to procurement processes at the territorial level, and also corruption in second place. They're two very different things, not knowing how to manage something versus corruption. So what's happened is that, and I don't know what you think about corruption, but following state agencies is quite hard. Sometimes they don't even publish procurements, and that makes different things happen. It's not necessarily just because of corruption. Colombia Compra Eficiente currently has open data policies, And this seeks to ensure that all the information that is gathered in SICOP is known by everybody. So, for example, everybody should know that in Soledad Antártico Atlántico, there are a certain number of providers for a certain amount of schools, who the contractors are, etc. The aim of this is not just to have statistics, but to be able to measure where procurement is concentrated in the country, or in which places prices can be elevated to market prices. This generates transparency at the national and international level. If you see that everything is anomalous or atypical in the market and the way it works, then that says something about the superintendent's office and the prosecutor's office, etc. It has worked very well up until now, and for what's left of the month, we are undergoing an accelerated project, because we have proposed that we should have an app that allows us to develop, say, data generation and statistic generation for not only nationals but also for foreigners, to see the kind of procurement that is performed for roads, what they're investing in, whether that's belts, whether that is bridges, how much does it cost, etc. So that is what Colombia Compra Eficiente wants, and that's what they can provide for nationals and foreigners. It's very hard to say that territorial entities are corrupt. In my experience, I can say that is not true. All the scandals that we see in Colombia now and that generate bad perception are the result of a good investigation that was performed. It doesn't mean that we're all very corrupt, in my opinion. Corruption is something that's been around for decades, and contracts, as in many countries, were adjudicated to that. I think Colombia is being more efficient in putting out there everything that's happened. It creates a kind of bad taste for nationals and foreigners, but if that happens, it's because we're doing things properly. The plan in Colombia Compra Eficiente is to make things clearer, and that everything can be perceived and measured. A few years ago, when we started having contracting issues, procurement issues in Colombia, there was a report that was issued in Bogota called the Rooks Report, and it showed how procurement was concentrated in 7 sectors: food, roads, child assistance, senior assistance, and after almost 10 years or 8 years, the results are clear. They're all in prison, and we're still uncovering these kind of cartels. What Colombia is missing, from our point of view at Colombia Compra Eficiente, are open data and tools, so that not just surveillance entities can avoid corruption, but also so that international contractors can say, perhaps these companies have been cartelized, they're cartels, so we should take them out of the market. Let's not just cross it all out. It's not so much that corruption is just emerging, but rather that thankfully it's being uncovered and being punished effectively now. So don't feel that you're coming into a country that is completely corrupt. Rather feel that you're coming into a country that is finally finding certain tools to be able to punish those who have somehow impeded your entry as foreigners in the country. Yes, thank you very much. Now that we are talking about corruption issues, to date we've been pointing out, say, strengths and weaknesses at the level of the government, the national government, but what can the vendors do, what can our audience do, and perhaps more specifically our international vendors do? First of all, to avoid facing these kinds of risks, but perhaps beyond that, to be able to contribute to improving the situation in the future. Okay, perfect. I think it's important that we establish the main risks and how to combat them. Companies such as Odebrecht have marvelous ethics codes of ethics. They've been well made, well founded, but they're not put into practice. So I think that the practices of strengthening ethical behavior, or common manifestations of corruption such as threats or bribery, it's important to strengthen that internally, because employees within the company have a lot of decision-making power that can be affected, and in the end it becomes something undutiful. So it's about making them real practices to prevent corruption, systems where we can report things internally, consultation reports of corruption, and unlawful practices. That's very important. It's no secret that bribery is common, perhaps, and also the Ernst & Young survey shows that 80% of Colombians believe that bribery and corruption are common practices in business. So essentially we need to combat common expressions such as bribery. In second place, we need to understand public entities well, understand legislation in order to avoid, say, bureaucracy charges or delays that shouldn't take place, and selection processes. Some of them do not fulfill the competence process because within this process certain proponents' documents were delayed, for example. So if we understand legislation, we understand the due diligence, we can identify anomalies, report them, and get Colombian authorities working. Get them going. As Maria Len said, this is quite true. In the last Gallup poll on perception, in the last few Gallup polls, corruption has gained greater importance, and that's because with the peace process we've stopped focusing on certain issues to start focusing on corruption, and that affects corruption perception too. I've got your piece of data. Brazil effectively is doing a bit better than Colombia in the index, but only by 3 points. So the difference isn't significant if we take into account, is that the percentage? In the scale of 100 points, the difference is 3 points. There is one thing with regards to the ranking, and that is that when we performed the poll in 2016, we still hadn't uncovered Odebrecht. So quite possibly the results that emerge in January next year, 2017, we will have a completely different context to that which we have nowadays. So in line with my colleagues' comments here, the main risks that institutions face in Colombia are precarious corruption, and corruption effectively we've just realized that it exists, but it's been there for many years. In 2011, when Juan Manuel Santos came to be president, this issue was placed on the public agenda and a modernization process for the state began. It was positive because we started to have anti-corruption bylaws and started to understand the role of business as a sector and business people in this. So it used to be public, and if it was linked to the public realm, then it was bad, it was dirty. But after the state modernization process, after being placed on the public agenda, and people said there is an issue and it's called corruption, we need to fight against it together. So private entrepreneurs, guilds, the public sector, citizens, we started to understand this issue. One of the characteristics of this issue is daily practices that are not identified or recorded as corruption. As Mario said about bribery, the national poll for bribery reveals that 41% of business people say that in the business environment there is bribery, and this was in 2014. So, sorry, 91% of business people. So we will have results from 2015 soon, and I think that that percentage, 91%, will increase because these are dynamics that exist within, say, the business environment, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that this environment, this business environment, starts in the electoral process, and we must mention that here. When the electoral process takes place, business people or the private sector, which in this case is 89% of the resources that are used to fund political campaigns, that's 89%, so that's more than 100 million pesos, and they are private resources. Therefore, public management is completely linked to the electoral process, and how it pans out will be linked to this. So Professor Garay, if you want to consult him to look at the role of business people in this whole landscape of corruption, then you can consult The Vicious Cycle of Corruption. Professor Garay, what he says is that business peoples are business people bribe and fund public campaigns with the exclusive aim of acquiring economic benefits, and he proposes a wonderful vicious cycle that I won't mention now, so as not to go on. But if you'd like to look into that, you can do so. Now, do any of you perhaps have any more proposals or ideas that foreign companies can use in order to contribute to this process or avoid risk? I'd like to strengthen the previous comment, expressing that zero tolerance, not pay the bribes, and report this in the channels that are available. I was going to say the same thing. The important thing here is to report it. Zero tolerance towards any expression of corruption. And if you identify it, you should tell governing bodies. And with that, we could perhaps overcome these situations. Now, I wanted to say one thing. In Colombia Compra Eficiente, it's all working well. And with the state, we created a framework agreement that was opened up by the Superintendent's Office for Industry and Commerce after the famous fruit and veg cartel. They were contractors that had come together to cheat. And so they won the best prices. It was such an impact, and they had such persecution from the state that some people had to go into a special program and tell on everybody else. So if this is the issue in Colombia, then that should be the duty of foreigners, because you are taking risks in a country you don't know, placing your capital there, and it's your responsibility to ensure that this doesn't happen. Okay, beyond transparency and corruption, do you have any other recommendations for our audience here in terms of public procurement and different processes, how to submit your documents, or perhaps their role within planning for different projects? Okay. We would like you to be aware of the tools that Colombia Compra Eficiente has made available to identify business opportunities, so you can register as providers in SECOP 2. Because when you register, you can identify the profile of the buyer, your interests, activities in the sectors you'd like to reach, or where you could lend your services. So in this case, we send you reports about the processes that have been opened up, most recent ones in recent days, so that you can be aware of what's going on, and you can prepare your offers with time. So knowledge of what's being procured on the part of the state is there. Findeter's invitation is for you to go on the web page. There's a link there on procurement where you can consult all the different calls that are currently in place, and you can look at the type of tender documents established by Findeter for all the services that it procures.
We invite you to present your observations when those processes are started, and to see if we can adequate some kind of rule to what you as a market consider that is affecting you, and we will review that, and if so, we will do the proper changes in order to have a better participation. For now, the important thing is interaction, for you to communicate with us, to interact with us with the different processes that we were doing, and as I told you, it is public knowledge, and you can find it in our website. talking about fourth generation contracts, I think that is an opportunity. Not being part of an initial partner of this doesn't mean that you cannot enter here. The change in the market, what the market does is that it makes some cleanse. Some partners are looking inside their own contracts, some alliance with other contractors, and there is the possibility to enter. And there is a secondary market. That means that the contracts have to be fulfilled, and all the efficiencies that appear in that sub-hiring can be taken advantage of by the different bidders. If you have expertise in tunnels, everything that we are launching for infrastructure that is resilient to climate change, there are also possibilities to enter. And we are talking about some agreements between private parties, but the meaning of these is the market is widening a lot because some partners don't have the capability of activating 5 contracts where they are located, or to activate all the different areas. So there is an important probability, and if there is efficient funding to present this to a community, so those are different points that can be considered in the negotiation, in the tendering. We have one person from Findeter that is joining us today. Hello, good afternoon. Another opportunity that you have, a business opportunity you have, is checking the UNDP. Colombia has certain loans and cooperation that is funded with resources from the multilateral bank, from the World Bank and the IDB. And this hiring is done with an exception of the application of the national norm. Therefore, you can review this in the case of international public tendering, or in the case of short lists if it's consultancy, so that your companies can effectively apply for the different contracts that are funded with resources from the bank, and they are doing some accompaniment to the resource process, to the awarding and the granting, and part of the warranty in terms of transparency of the process as such. And an extra recommendation is always try to find a way to present an association if it's so that your company is the leader. If it's a leader in a short international list, you have more chances of being in the short list than if you are part of the competence when the Colombian firms are being part of this. So I'm just summing up as we said before. The first module of the next day is going to be procuring from different entities like the CAF or the IDB. So I also take advantage of making the question this topic, that is what kind of measures a private company can do to be part of this tendering process in this kind of projects. So we are always showing acquisition element that is presented by the banks of the United Nations document, and they state that which where the loan is aimed, and approximately which are going to be the elements that are going to be taken by this credit. So you have to be wary of the general announcement of acquisition, and there are some elements by each bank taken, and it's migrating to our new information systems. But we have one that is called SEPA, where you can find the acquisition plan, what is going to be hired on 18 months time, and then we start doing an acquisition plan on 12 months, so that you can be attentive about what kind of what kind of tenderings are being used, if it's consultancy, if it's services or other kind of services for consulting, and it's something that is done first at 18 months and then to 12 months. Outstanding. I wanted to ask concerning the different entities. Besides the Spaniards, there is a lot of participation of foreign people in Colombia in the tendering. In our case from Findeter, there is participation not only from Spaniards, but we are also hiring resources from the multilateral bank, also cooperation AFD. All these situations are heavily focused to have participation in the market of these countries that are cooperating with Colombia through FINDETER. So they are open, they have their own interaction mechanisms with the people that are interested in their countries, and they have arrived from different parts, from Chile, Mexico, from Venezuela. You have also found people from Venezuela. We have found contractors from the United States. For example, in this moment we have processes of solar panels, also with cooperation resources, and we have been able to move forward in this acquisition of solar panels with participation of foreign companies. And in terms of consultancy, the market is even wider, as in some action plans and all of this, we are also considering a lot of foreign companies. Outstanding. In fact, if anybody has any other contribution in terms of proposal or recommendation, I guess that we can open to questions from the audience. I don't know if someone would like to state something. Well, I remember that we had a very interesting discussion with Raoul in terms of how an entity that is interested on being our provider, how can they tell me about the question. I mean, how how can we introduce ourselves without when we have these type of barriers of certification? The problem was a bit like what we mentioned before. In the Anglo-Saxon world, it's not common to ask for a certificate, and it's not something that is properly seen. I mean, the difference between the Anglo-Saxon world and ours is that in theirs it's for granted that if a company says, I did this work, it, they did it, and period. Here we have to prove it. So part of the difficulty and what we were mentioning before starts in stating that we don't know beforehand which are going to be the specific requests for certification that are going to be requested. Now we're going to have Bogota Metro, and we don't know specifically what type of experience or what type of metro is going to be required. So we cannot foresee what is going to happen because specifically we don't know where to go. We have a lot of experience in PMO, we have experience in metro and railways, but some kind of metros that we haven't done. So that is a large difficulty, and that's why we were mentioning this, and we mentioned even with a letter that we had from the English ambassador asking to continue to deliver the certificates, and if we were the winners, also all the process that goes with the notary, with apostilles, or the certification that would be necessary. So, who would like to tell us about the type of issues of incompatibility of documents and the lack of knowledge about the requisites? Well, that difference in the treatment in terms of national international, because we have the register of proponents, that is where the national proponents are taking this information, these certifications, and all these elements are properly registered there. That's why the moment that they present themselves, they only have their certificate when they have already registered everything. Of course, it's a duty that the foreign companies are exempted from, and that's why they are asking for the certifications and others. That's why the need of verifying that that experience indeed they have it, and in that terms the ruling is quite clear and it is being requested. So we have this possibility, as you mentioned, I understand, is that you want the same treatment that the simple copies in terms of the apostille to be done after the award is done. But for the time being, it is not allowed. We will have to see the possibility but it is not possible in the meantime. The problem is based on the very same convention, the Hague Convention. If you are part of the convention, it is a commitment of different countries that state that those documents that we want to make valid in the country that they are being presented, they have to have that procedure properly done. So if the country that is signing the convention is agreeing and is submitting to those rules, both Colombia, if it's going, any Colombian wants to go there, they need to have the same procedure as the documents that we want to exert in another country in Colombia, they should have that procedure. So it's an agreement between different countries that submitted to fulfill that procedure. Therefore, to remove from that duty that is taken in the international treaty is something very complex because they are subscribers of the Hague Convention. So the proposal is not to subtract yourself, but in the when do you have to apply it? I mean, do you have to apply it to fulfill the contract? But well, that is the situation. When are you evaluating the proponents? Well, they are being evaluated when they present that tender. So the problem is that I cannot do an exception because for some of them I can validate information in one way when there is an international treaty that was properly ratified by a law in Colombia. So, to move to what the law has done, it's something very complex in a specific moment of the evaluation, because what they are stating is stop applying the law in a moment of the process, that is, when effectively we are appraising, we're evaluating the different experiences. So, doing that discrimination in legal terms is not something that we find quite proper due to the inequality that we can have on the situation. So the recommendation is try to procure as much as possible if you want to be part of the Colombian market to have a certification. For example, you know already what is the market, what is the type of demands that we have already established, the value, the scope, maybe the different activities that are going to be developed that are properly discriminated, the starting time when the project started, when it finished, and maybe to say that it was finished and the contractual goal was completed. Those are the elements that should be considered on a certification, and under these parameters it's difficult not to be validated. And if we have the certification in those terms, we can proceed to do this work on the apostille or legalization to avoid at the beginning any kind of difficulties. So considering this is something valid, the problem would be the time that is given from the moment that the person is summoned until the offer is presented. All this can be done, but takes time nevertheless. So what we have seen is that this time is very reduced. So many of the companies as ours cannot participate. We have participated sometimes here, but unfortunately we are always in a poor position. So it's kind of, but you're fulfilling your requisites. If you're out to the ballot, you are fulfilling your requisites. I understand what you're saying. What I'm saying is that in general there is a large difficulty, and in general, as we have to expect in order to be able to know what is the specific order that is going to be requested, mostly for the types of work that are general works of the first order. Something important is that we have to do a follow-up of the drafts. In the case of Colombia Compra, we have the tender drafts, and that gives you more time. We awarded like 1 week or 2 weeks ago the framework for citizen surveillance, and inside there was a Mexican company, and they did a prior surveillance of the different drafts, and they completed the documentation. What happens is that they were advised by Colombian lawyers, but they have a huge boost and they enter without problems. The thing is that you don't have to wait for the element, but you have to consider they're willing to hire of any entity. And the thing is that they are in the investment plans of the entities, and it's foreseeable to see what do they need and what type of general certification they need as well. So it is about forecasting in some cases. Sometimes the time is rather short, but the follow-up to this work is essential so that you can enter. Sorry, in the case of Indeter, as I said before, we have some reference terms, type reference terms, and they clearly specify what should be contained on the certification, the experience. So, for example, you can have some reference terms for the issue that matters to you, or the aqueduct or others, and you're going to be identifying what is needed in certification. For example, what we usually ask for. If we are going to make an aqueduct and we need a treatment plant, so we are asking for experience in the creation of this plant. What is going to make the difference one process from the other is the capability of the plan. But if you have already created plans, you are only asking for the capability, and already with the certification, after you have done the whole process, you will have the possibility of knowing if Inter is going to be there or not. Again, I am stating, because certification usually is applies the same rule that with others, depending on what is going to be hired. If I'm going to buy the plan plus driving, I have to accredit also, I have to certify some experience in construction of those drivers. But it is not always 100% of the time, but it's a percentage of that is effectively going to be applied. So it's much about being familiar with different demands of the entities with which you want to hire, to see what they usually ask for in their work, and to be prepared to prepare them. And what we can see in Colombia con Preficiente is that from the very same drafts, or what we call as officers the tender documents, we can start interacting with different entities from different observations, or we can identify the type of requisites are being requested for each one of the certification in terms of experience of each one of the processes. Thank you very much. Somebody else has a question, taking advantage that we still have the people that are in charge of the platform and hiring entities as well. Well, following a bit with the topic, for us, we are an Anglo-Saxon company, and we worked in a lot of companies around the world, and we work in countries such as India, and I think that they are even worse than Colombia in terms of bureaucracy. But the language for us is one of the issues, that institutionally speaking, we don't have too much people, too many Spanish-speaking people. And I think that for English companies, when we're talking about infrastructure, is a lot easier, and for the private sector, for the public sector, is very complicated for the British company, for the same reasons that we already mentioned. That a lot of things are not compatible, and some of the things that we haven't even mentioned. That I remembered about some tender documents, the amount of contracts that we have around the world that were, for example, when a company in 60 different countries and 70,000 employees it's sometimes difficult to meet those requirements, and that is easy for a country when we work inside a country, but this is not something that is realistic for us, at least for us. Somebody else has another question or another comment? I would like to make a short question. Hello, how are you? My name is Nelson Beltran. I'm the director of NYE, and I'm always curious that the governance procedures are not always standard. So I would like to make a question to the people from Colombia con Preficiente about the legal requirements on that matter. So some specific questions, for example, not always for companies that are located in Colombia we are demanding these elements to be properly registered in the bidders registry. I know that the entities have the possibility of requesting these or not. So for the companies that are located outside abroad, I have participated in such processes where effectively they are requesting the certification. But as Raul mentioned, uh, it is not requested that this work has to be properly apostilled. So, and I don't know if there are some specific guidelines or some requirements in terms of laws or regulations that force bind us to do so, because sometimes the feeling that we have is that they make the process so difficult that what they do is that they impede that companies or other elements that have the proper knowledge can effectively present to the bidding. So I don't know how mandatory is this type of requirements, and I would like you to enlighten us a bit on the topic, if it's possible. Sure. In terms of the registration of the experience in the RUP, to me it's kind of strange that you say that you are admitting elements that are not properly registered, because they must be registered. All the tenders for the national proponents or the foreign proponents that have a branch in Colombia, they have to request the RUP, and it's only going to be validated experience that is registered and that is properly mentioned at the time of the awarding or before awarding. I know that is for enablers, the score or scorers. Yeah, for enablers. What we are mentioning goes to a large difficulty. In the RUP, we are a Colombian society that belongs to a unique company that is located all around the world. 100% of the Colombian society comes from the mother company that is located in England. In each country, from the 44 countries that are participating, we have a company that has 100% of the shares participating in the same company. So this is distributed in all the companies around the world. So here we cannot apply them to the RUP. So that there's a limiting factor that takes all the companies like us from any tendering in Colombia. So are you in the consult? But I haven't taken you out. So maybe the terms have to be more flexible. So the two of them that we lost them with you. But okay. I arrived with certificates, as I told you before. Those were certificates from different companies inside our organization. But it's not that I can register them as such. Well, that requisite is for Colombian or foreign people that have a seat in Colombia. We are a SAS, simplifying anonymous society, while 100% of the stocks of the shares are part of the international work, the same as in other countries. Well, I understand. The thing is that you cannot summon the experience of the matrix. You have to be a plural. The thing is that the matrix doesn't have any kind of experience. The experience comes from the companies in the subsidiaries. There is no experience in the matrix. You have to present with the others to accredite experience, because in the unique record they don't have it. This is what is happening to you. Maybe you have it from the branches, but you will have to present it with the branches, otherwise it's not valid. That is what we have in the RUP. The only thing that appears is the RUP in the unique register of proposers in terms of the SAS that you're presenting. So you took all the international companies out of the game then. In the case of IDB and the World Bank, RUP is not it's not something that
y
is
los
forced.
procesos que se financian con
The
recursos
process
del
that I
Banco Mundial y
funded
del BID
by
no es
resources
una obligación
of this, they don't have to present
no
the
es
RIP,
una
and
obligación
it's not a
establecida por
duty
la
to
ley,
be presented
precisamente
in
por
the
eso.
RUP for the same
Precisamente
reason,
porque se tiene en cuenta
because
desde
they
la
are taken
legal
into account from a legal point of
que
view
si usted se
that
presenta
if
aquí
you
como
are
sucursal,
presented as a
su
branch,
empresa
Your company, your headquarters are still you, and it's your experience, and that is something that is considered, is taken into account. Well, the thing is that the system is different from the one that is used for other cases. That's why we don't apply this for this one. So, in any tendering, we cannot be part of it. In that case, with that, unfortunately, you wouldn't be accepted. So, it will be like a temporary union or a consortium with the other branch in another country. So, for example, if you have to take experience from more than one country, in that case, you will have to hire all these branches. It's complex, but unfortunately, that is how it works. That is one of the huge pits that we have. The topic is the requirements that are made. If you want to have international experience, you have to consider a company like ours that have international experience. This international experience is in the head of each one of them, because in order to operate here, I have to register myself here. For my work in every day, I'm registered in Colombia as an SAS. There are companies that have registered. I have seen a different tendering that I have had. There are some companies that are registered as if they were born in Colombia today. But there are some other companies that are registered as foreign companies. They are registered, but they have their own background. They are registering the headquarters as the work they have, and it's impossible that this experience is not considered in the work that you do. But in that case, we are evaluating as an external tenderer. In that case, they don't have to register all the contracts in the RUP that is contributing. But in this case, would have the limitation of the documents that we're mentioning, because they have to present the certification one-on-one to accredite them for experience. So, in the assumption that we just mentioned, well, those things exist, we do have them, but again, if you're going to go to the detail, the certification is going to say this and this and that. But if you're going to go to the contract as such, it's going to be Arab Emirates, or Singapore, or France, or in our case, for example, we have the SAS Colombia. We are a unique company because we are unique partners, but it's structured in a global matrix. I understand the assumption, but under these conditions, the experience is from the branch that is in another country, not in Colombia, not the SAS. That is something that happened in one of the cycle, in a large cycle, and you're not going to have the global experience of the companies that obviously want to help Colombia to grow. But you have to change that. How can we integrate that experience to help for the growth of the country? Otherwise, it's impossible. And that's how we are not going to be. We are going to continue with the same corruption, with the same problems that we had before. If we cannot have even a single union with the people that is giving the agreements, and we cannot integrate our experience in your information system, because our experience comes from the United States or Brazil or Singapore or from England. As I have experience, I have the same experience that my partner in Brazil or from India or in other parts. So your system is not working properly to deliver the issues that you want to fix. So some of these elements are essential, maybe, and I love Colombia, but doing this, it's impossible to work. We understand your feeling.
Yes, at a general level, I think that's input for potential improvements in the future. I'm sure you'll agree with me. It's a system that can change and improve the future. Yes, we can revise that and look at the possibility of seeing whether it's necessary to kind of leverage reforms to the standards for public procurement. Unfortunately, this is the current state, but we can take this into account and allow them to participate under these conditions, but obviously that requires revision and modification as well. In the contract, when we look at the conditions of the leader and the group, we do allow this. It's a standard contract. It's open in infrastructure. Given that the requirements were so high due to such significant amounts, when you had these restrictions, you would close the market a lot. We wanted to boost it with other actors, so this was the modification. Both are participating within the tender process. It's very different when when you have lots of people participating and complying with the requirements, but it's a whole other thing to win it. But we did want to adjust it. There are clear rules for the game. If you want to go, then you have to comply with certain requirements. If not, then you have to stay with that, so that we can go for cocktails. We'll have a final question, but I don't know if perhaps any of the panelists have a few final words for our audience. We're obviously open to learning about what's going on around the world. The only way of doing that is by looking at the contracts that are being signed, the publications. We've been very good about coming here so that we can put these good lessons into practice, these lessons we have learned from other countries that perhaps made mistakes at one point in time and were able to resurrect. That is our work, and part of our prior studies are about exactly that, to be able to count on people so that we can have a lot more expertise. So it can be seen as a win-win situation, not like doing something behind closed doors. From the council, at the council was accompanied by someone, and obviously we're still learning, but doors are still open because we still believe we can continue to grow. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Okay, finally I'd like to invite you to consult our webpage, colombiacompra.gov.co. In the lower part you'll find some links. One of those refers to manuals, guidelines and standards in general. There's a specific guideline for foreign providers, foreign vendors. There's a synthesis of the information there. It's within everyone's reach about public procurement, how that is governed now, and recommendations when it comes to presenting an offer. In at Transparencia por Colombia, we want to call or bring your responsibility to the fore as business people, your social responsibility, business responsibility, when you create a link with another Colombian company or the Colombian state, to be able to strengthen corporate integrity channels. I have a parish announcement. I have an open bidding process right now that has been funded with BID resources to be able to renew water services for the island of San Andres. It's worth $9 million. It's been published on SECOP, and I'd like to invite you to consult that in SECOP. Okay, and finally, our executive director, I believe, is going to close for our panel speakers. Thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I'm going to stand over here. It's quite warm, isn't it? but you'll be cold. You'll sacrifice your warmth for the good of the common good. Okay, Findeter, Transparencia por Colombia, Colombia Compra Eficiente, and ANI, the National Infrastructure Agency. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you for assisting, for attending rather. I think that one of the most valuable things we'll take with us is that direct interaction with the entities of the state that are performing these processes on a daily basis. So thank you very much for your participation. I hope you took down some notes. We all have queries and we're all here because we're interested in making Colombia better based on the experience that we all have as companies, and as we gradually find points, meeting points that facilitate our process, I'm sure we'll be able to better satisfy this. Thank you very much for that announcement. As I said in the beginning, we found that processes funding with money from the World Bank and the BID are a lot friendlier towards or with regards to the way that we can participate as international firms. So perhaps we could take some of these experiences with us to enrich our own processes. But 1,000 thank yous for helping us, for attending, and for us it has been extremely useful. I hope that it has been valuable participation for you. As I understand it, we will hand you some gifts so that you can remember us with warmth and with these sweets. So we'll be expecting you at the JW Marriott at the hotel. If you can't be with us this afternoon then, or this evening, we'll see you here tomorrow on the same channel. Thank you.